any kind of day, Armenian, I don't even know all the days. That's a slippery. They opened the door, right? Any business,
Yeah.
uh, they opened the door when they wanted to support various communities, and by
Yes.
closing the door on
Yes.
us, that's a choice that they
Yes.
make.
I know. And they did it knowing that doing Pride Night back in June caused a big situation last year, and potentially could this year when people find out that they did a Pride Night and they're not doing Jewish Community Night, or for that matter, as I told you, they're not doing Christian Faith Night either. But that was their cover for not doing Jewish Community Day. They're not doing any faith days. So
Well,
there
it's
you
smart.
go.
They everything into one.
John, do you understand if I get real mad and reach out to my Christian minister colleagues and talk to them about the fact that the Dodgers decided to not include them in Faith Night? Do you know what would happen then? That's a
Well,
whole other level of ballistic that I can go on then.
what's the burden?
What?
See the benefit. What's the burden?
The burden is I blow them up.
So,
The burden is, I mean, that's
Do
in
you
the
want to,
background.
Well, next time you want a favor, then you won't get it.
I don't
exactly.
ask, but I
You
don't
want to
ask them.
save
I don't
that,
ask
but
them.
you
I
want to
don't ask
spend
them.
your clout on.
I don't ask them for
You gotta
favors.
choose your battles.
I've never asked them for favors. I'm just telling you, when people do stuff like this, and I'm talking about in other communities, they do stuff like that. And it's just a question of whether I want to do stuff like that. I mean, for years, that's what Al Sharpton did in New York. Look, you know what I'm talking about. People in faith communities and ethnic communities for years have done what they needed to do to get their community agenda advanced. And the Jewish community is sometimes overly hesitant to do what they need to do because we don't want to be perceived as being pushy. We don't want to be perceived, people already perceive us and we feel guilty because there is a sense of white privilege to what we take, which, by the way, we take more seriously than any white person that I know. But that's a subject for a whole nother time. But that all those things play out, and I know it. I'm just being honest about it. I also know my own feelings about it. I feel uncomfortable sometimes about it. But at the same time, who's defending our community right now? Who is? I don't know who is. I don't see anybody defending our community right now. So, and if they do, they generally have their own agenda, which isn't necessarily our agenda. So I'm just saying this is not the time for us to say, well, catch them next year.
yeah, that's right. Especially what happened this year. It's silly. It's
So
loud and clear. They might as well just put a big billboard on Sunset Boulevard, right? We don't, anyway, whatever.
So that was my update. And I hope everyone's on and you now know what's going on behind the scenes. As I said, some of it's important, some of it's, in the end of the day, it's a baseball game. But there are other issues here, and it has to do with our community. It has to do with strengthening our community, representing our community, and the balances of stuff that I need to do. And at the end of the day, I didn't choose August 7th for the Bring Them Home Now thing, but now I got a text 5 minutes ago from them saying that they want to help. They want some help with the press coverage of the rally they're doing the next week.
Is LA not the second largest Jewish population in the United States?
Yes, we are.
All right, case closed.
Yeah. So today we're starting with Psalm 41, which interestingly, and I planned this we got to 40, and last week we finished with Psalm 40 and U2 and played you an amazing modern version. We're gonna play a modern version of Psalm 42 in a second, but it's not modern in the sense of what you think is maybe modern, but it is very new, actually. It's only about 2 years old, this version of Psalm 42. But we finished with Psalm 40, and today we're starting with Psalm 41, which is actually the last psalm in the first of the 5 books. And so we're going to look at kind of why this psalm ended what we consider the first the 5 sections of Psalms. And so this is actually like what we begin with is actually an ending, which is an ending of you know, of a section and of what might have been a way of organizing. And you might be saying at the end of the day, well, so who cares what books there are? It doesn't come up a lot, by the way, because Psalms are so rarely read, in the way we're doing it, that they're always read kind of out of order, and they're always read or sung as part of liturgy, but they're not. We don't ever go through 30 or 40 of them at once. And so we don't like come to an end of a book and go, hey, we finished a book of Psalms, I'm saying. So it works a little differently than it does with other books of the Bible, in the sense that like it's almost a non-issue. A lot of people don't even know that there's books of Psalms, that there's 5 books. So just to tell you, like most people don't know that. And they don't know where the breaks are because they're not, 30, 30, and 30. So it's not like that. But it is part of the organizational structure. It is part of the kind of the mentality of, at least maybe we could say, of the editor of Psalms, which we don't know anything about the editorial decisions of how the Psalms were organized, or again, we know when they were organized because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls and we have the Septuagint, and we have, a date where we know that they were organized by. And we kind of can see by a certain point in Jewish history where people are referring to Psalms in a way that it seems like it's like we know what they're talking about. We're talking about the same thing, rather than, again, probably the way they were originally written, which is, well, not probably. We know they weren't written where somebody sat down and go, hey, we finished Psalm 3, let's now get on to Psalm 4. So we know they didn't do that. But again, we get to a point about 200 BCE where we know, oh yeah, this was the organization of the Psalms. This was the book. They took it out and they said, let's, we're going to sing from Psalm, 4 now. And it was in the temple. It was in the second temple that they had, a scroll of Psalms. Not just to say book, but a scroll of Psalms. So let's take a look at this last of this first section, and kind of you'll see the indicator that we're at the you'll see the indicator within the psalm at the end. I'll point it out. So let's start. It begins with Lemnat Seach for the leader, and then Mizmor LeDavid, which we've seen throughout the Psalms. And you'll start to see changes on that a little bit as we go through this book. All right. Rosemary.
Happy is he who is thoughtful of the wretched. In bad times, may the Lord keep him from harm. May the Lord guard him and preserve him, and may he be thought happy in the land. Do not subject him to the will of his enemies. The Lord will sustain him on his sickbed. You shall wholly transform his bed of suffering. I said, O Lord, have mercy on me. Heal me, for I have sinned against you. My enemies speak evilly of me. When will he die and his name perish? If one comes to visit, he speaks falsely. His mind stores up evil thoughts. Once outside, he speaks them. All my enemies whisper together against me, imagining the worst for me. Something baneful has settled in him. He'll not rise from his bed again. My ally, in whom I trusted, even he who shares my bread, has been utterly false to me. But you, O Lord, have mercy on me. Let me rise again and repay them. Then shall I know that you are pleased with me, when my enemy cannot shout in triumph over me. You will support me because of my integrity, and let me abide in your presence forever. Blessed is the Lord, God of Israel, from eternity to eternity. Amen and amen.
You can see why maybe that last line again is an added line, because it doesn't quite go with the previous line, in the sense that It looks like an editor popped that in at the end to mark the end of the book. Maybe because the previous line is a great way to end the psalm too, and probably was the way the psalm originally ended. In the sense that, you'll see as we get to the ends of each book, the way they end. So it kind of gives it away. The psalm really does kind of almost feel like it was written by a king, somebody that people are conspiring against, right? That they're trying to get him. Some people, have said in especially, if you will, the Christian midrash, that this kind of really seems to be about Judas, right? Because Judas, as you know, was there at the Last Supper and shares bread with him, and is utterly false, right? And so there's that idea that this is somebody who's turning on him.
What's with the Hebrew in the brackets there?
It's
like a share and something else.
Yeah, let me see. Yeah, where was that?
There it is. Line 3.
Oh, yeah. So, excuse me. So this is the way. This is the way. So this is the way it's written, and this is the way that it makes sense. So it's kind of the Jewish way of saying there's a scribal error here, and so whenever you see the brackets, it's a scribal error. The scribal errors are usually really easy to explain, and it's like, okay, so this is Ve'ashar. It says Yashar. It doesn't make sense. Why does it say it like this? Because we read it the way it's written. We can't change it, but we know that it's not written properly. And so what happened in this case, no, excuse me, it's the other way around. It's what I meant to say, is that this is Ye'asher is what it should be. Ve'asher is the way it's written, or is the way it's written and pronounced. What happened is that the Yud, as scribes were writing it, at some point, some lazy scribe turned a Yud into a Vav, and the Vav stayed, and everybody kind of knows that it's supposed to be a Yud. So it's what we call the Kri, which is the way it's written, versus the Ketiv, or Kri the way it's said, versus Ketiv the way it's written. So you'll see that occasionally. It's a scribal error, and again, usually it's a Yud that has now become a Vav. Sometimes it's a Daled that's become a Resh, where the little tail came off. They're very easy to, they're obviously scribal errors, and we can't change them. So that's what they are. And you'll see them, every so often. And again, it just makes more sense when we know that it's a Yud and not a Vav. So, yeah. So as I said, some people said this was kind of like, Jesus talking. Makes a lot more sense that it's like a king. It seems like a lot more like the person who is, some kind of head of a country, head of a company, head of something, where people are conspiring against them to try to get them. The reason why, and again, the Christian midrash is doing nothing other than what Jewish midrash does too, which is take a line out of context. But one of the reasons why it doesn't really seem to be talking about Judas is that it's about lots of enemies against him. And so the fact that Jesus had one ally, one of his disciples, turned against him, this really seems like there's a lot of people that are against them. And my ally is, and again, Gam Ish, the person who should be giving me shalom, is more generic in the sense that my friends, we would say, you talked about somebody in the singular, but you're definitely talking about people in the plural. Well, he did talk about people in the plural. He said, my enemies. He said, and again, it's definitely plural. But again, people took the lines where he's speaking singularly and wrote midrash about it. So you can definitely see that this is along the lines of something that King David could have said. It really does feel like, somebody who's under the gun and who is being conspired against. But the person, again, is putting their faith in God. And to some extent, how do I know that God's on my side? Because God won't let me fall, right? God won't let me be destroyed by these people. Any questions, comments, any thoughts? So again, when it ends with this final phrase, it's blessing, right? It sounds like a good way to cap the end of a book. And we did the first set of Psalms. Does the next Psalm completely go in a different direction than the previous one? Like the Psalm 42 go in a different direction than what we've seen, like in this Psalm or in previous Psalms? Not necessarily. The changes that go on in the books are oftentimes they're not marked by, hey, this now Psalm is completely different than the Psalms that came before it, which kind of indicates to us that the editorial decisions of where to break them had more to do with book length than it did thematic decisions and saying, oh, those are Psalms about King David, or those are Psalms that are about going up to Jerusalem, or these are Psalms that are that are generic and don't really have a time or a place where they need to be said. No, it's not like that. So that's why it's not thematically organized. There are groups of Psalms that go together. This is not, but that doesn't go through the whole book, a whole book, and it doesn't go through necessarily continuity of the books, and even with the titles. Because look, this one now definitely deviates. Yeah.
I have a question. Based on what you said, and assuming this was written before their time, is this a prophecy psalm?
No, that's why a lot of people say it doesn't sound like a prophecy, because it sounds like King David wrote this out of his experience. So that's why we wouldn't say it necessarily seems like it's speaking about something that happens in the future. Well, the immediate future, and that David feels that as long as his supposed allies aren't triumphant, God's with him. So it definitely feels like, he's writing it maybe not as the end of his life, but at a time when, maybe his son is conspiring against him, or he knows other people are conspiring against him. Definitely feels like he's already got power. So it's not like the King Saul times where he's really under the gun and he's really getting chased and pursued. But there seems to be like he's stable, but in his stability, things are not going the way he'd hoped they would go. But it doesn't seem like there's chaos. It doesn't seem like he's actually fleeing the scene, if you will. It seems like, again, when someone comes to visit him, seems to imply that he's at least in a power position, But again, it doesn't seem like he's talking about way in the future. So this Psalm 42 begins with a different ascription to Korach. Now, what's interesting about this is that, again, it says Lemnatseach, which seems to be, again, for the leader, for the conductor. And now it's called, we've had this before, a maskil. So we've had the term maskil before, but we have not had the term B'nai Korach. Now, what's interesting about, of course, B'nai Korach is that Korach is Moses' cousin, who we read about in Numbers, who leads a rebellion against him. As a matter of fact, there's a whole parsha named after Korach that we read a few weeks ago that's about the revolt that Moses has to deal with within his own family, within his own tribe, within the power structures that were there to kind of help him, to support him, which is interesting because that kind of goes with the psalm we read before, which is, people are coming against you. But what's interesting about the Korachites, by this point, they're not a problem. As a matter of fact, There are priests. The Korahites are Levites at least, and they seem to have written music. They seem to have at least had their, or maybe their own collection of psalms. And if the Bnei Korach, if the descendants of Korach are not expelled from the community hundreds of years later, if they're still referred to as Bnei Korach, that means that Korach's own children didn't go into the rebellion with them, which again, we don't really understand like what really happened with Korach. We really, I mean, the Torah tells us what happened to Korach, but we really don't understand the full essence of what happens because the Torah doesn't tell us what happens to Korach's sons. It doesn't, it just tells us what happens to the band that was with him. They get swallowed up by the earth. But if we're talking about Bnei Korach hundreds of years later, and that they're writing things for the temple, that means that he had descendants that were well respected and were still part of the temple. We're still alive. So that tells us something really interesting about Bnei Korach, at least again in our mind, in our midrash, in our explanations, which are that children don't necessarily make the mistakes of their parents. And so the Bnei Korach are actually held up as a prime example of you don't have to do what your father did. You don't have to make the same mistakes. So Bnei Korach are really to some extent the paramount example of not repeating your parents' mistakes. And they're really kind of like, we don't know anything about them. We know nothing about them. But we do know that there's psalms that are, and this is not the only psalm, there are psalms that are ascribed to Bnei Korach. Again, these are descendants of Korach. We 100% assume these are Levites, 100% assume it's the same Korach. Maybe it's not. Maybe the story of Korach was meant to put a bad light on some of the Levites. We don't know. It's all supposition. It's all interesting speculation. We just don't have it. The Torah doesn't say the Torah itself and the Bible itself doesn't say anything else about the Korahites, except the Psalms that are ascribed to them. So, yeah, it becomes an interesting midrash in itself, just the fact that they have Psalms. Whatever else they did, however else they survived, however else they decided, most importantly, at the time of Moses, they didn't go along with their dad in rebelling against Moses. They said, no, Dad, you're wrong. I mean, that's the midrash. That's the explanation that we have of why they're still with us, why they made it. So the psalm itself begins, and the psalm would have been known because the psalm wasn't known by Bnei Korach, because as I said, there's other Korachite psalms. It begins with this very famous phrase, like a hind crying for water, which you'll see right here. All it is saying is that this word ta'arog is not a normal word we use for water or streams. It's not a normal word. We believe that ayil ta'arog is a phrase, an idiom that people used. Similar, well, not similar in the meaning, but similar to the phrase that we use that, you can't lead a horse to water. But in this case, so we still use that phrase, even though most of us don't ride horses, we understand it's used as an idiom. A hind crying for water, or a hind trying to get to the water, or desiring water. I don't know, Mary, do you have what the King James says? For crying for water, or trying to get to the water, ta'arog al afike mayim.
It says, as the hart panteth after the water brooks.
Yeah. So we believe that phrase was an idiom. Now, of course, let's read it and you'll see why it's such a beautiful phrase.
Like a hind crying for water, my soul cries for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, the living God. Oh, when will I come to appear before God?
Now, again, I'm not saying this psalm is completely different than what we read before, but this phrase and this type of approach is definitely something that we're going to start seeing more and more in this section, which is Psalms that talk about God and our desire to be with God in a way that is spiritually, well, it's still spiritually uplifting. That phrase, Sama nafshi, my soul thirsts for God, is a very powerful and beautiful image of, again, comparing our desire for spirituality, to feel God's essence, to feel God's spirit, to feel spiritually alive. And we're going to see that phrase coming up in this section a lot. This idea is kind of like still something for people they draw inspiration from. This idea that, like the deer needs to have water, like the deer will take itself down to the water, right? That's the way my soul feels towards wanting to be with God. So it's a beautiful phrase. It's a beautiful idea. It's not even hopeful. It shows the spiritual desire, the spiritual quest that people have. And again, we don't quite get the idiom because we don't use the idiom, but you can understand it in the sense that, when a deer is going to water, it's survival, right? It's the way it survives. It's the way it can't live without going to the water. But of course, when the deer goes to water, it's in its most exposed moment. It's the ultimate time where if somebody's hunting the deer or chasing the deer, it's the point where that deer is most likely going to be vulnerable to an attack. So it needs the water, it wants the water, it's going to go to the water, but it also knows that at that moment, it's also the most vulnerable. And you don't care. We don't care. I don't care. And so that phrase, the way we understand it, whether you're going to translate it as pant or cry or needs to have, that's what we're willing to do. That's what we're willing to do to be close to God. So again, idiom needs a little explanation, but we get it. I mean, hopefully you get it. So this is going to be a phrase that we see. And again, how, when will that happen, right? It's kind of, at this point, still a question in the song.
My tears have been my food. Day and night, I am ever taunted with, "Where's your God?" When I think of this, I pour out my soul. How I walked with the crowd, moved with them, the festive throng to the house of God with joyous shouts of praise. Why so downcast, my soul? Why disquieted within me? Have hope in God. I will yet praise him for his saving presence. Oh my God, my soul is downcast. Therefore, I think of you in this land of Jordan and Hermon, in Mount Mizar, where deep calls to deep in the roar of your cataracts. All your breakers and billows have swept over me. By day, may the Lord vouchsafe his faithful care, so that at night a song to him may be with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk in gloom, oppressed by my enemy? Crushing my bones, my foes revile me, taunting me always with, "Where's your God?" Why so downcast, my soul? Why disquieted within me? Have hope in God. I will yet praise him, my ever-present help, my God.
Yeah. So, look, this is not the first time we've heard the psalmist say, "Where are you, God? I don't feel you. I feel like you've abandoned me." We saw it, obviously, the most famous is, "Oh Lord, my Lord, why have you forsaken me?" But what's interesting about how this tone is different is, first of all, first, obviously you can see over and over again, and again, crushing my bones, and that we've had that kind of imagery before. But this idea that my soul, right, the word nafshi that's used over and over again in this psalm, we don't have that in Psalm 22. But in this psalm, we really do. And there is a different tone, and it definitely seems like a kind of a different feeling to this, which is one not necessarily of a king, though there is that, the person has enemies, but it's more like, colleagues. It's more like just people that normal people would meet on the street, not people conspiring to take them down or out of power. But there is a sense that my enemies are taunting me or against me, not because they're trying to take me out of power, but because they're saying, you're stupid. You believe in God. You think that, God is going to help you. It's more of that, which is what everybody feels. And so there's a universality of this in this psalm that we don't always get in the other psalms, and it's much more of like, yeah, this is the way I felt today. This is the way. This is not like as dramatic as some of the other psalms, because it seems like this is a psalm that somebody could have just said in the moment of any day. There definitely is a sense that this is, and we've had it before and we'll have it again. There is a sense of going to the temple. I mean, that's something we don't always see, but it definitely feels like, there's a religious component to this. But again, what is the religious component? It's that people are going through the motions of the religion. They're showing up at the temple, but is it really happening, right? Is the spiritual energy really happening there, right? Everyone's doing the motions, right? But it doesn't feel, I'm not feeling it. People are getting in the temple, they're singing, there's noise, everyone's excited, but is it really happening? So these lines are interesting, of course, because they really refer to, places in Israel, right? This is kind of, as much as this is universal, there's also a sense here that this is specifically the feeling that, I'm at home, I'm in Israel, but I'm still not feeling it. Of course, the irony that we have this week is this place right here was just in the news, my friends. That's where Majdal Shams is. That's where the soccer field was, on Mount Hermon. So that was ironically or tragically, coincidentally, just, when we say my soul is downcast, my soul is like bowed over, broken or bent, kicked in the gut. I don't know if that's the best translation, but my soul is downcast. There definitely were people who were feeling that way this last weekend, watching, bodies of kids being taken off of Mount Hermon. So, yeah, it's ironic, but it also, of course, shows you that, was the land part of Israel 2,000 years ago? Was it part of it? Yeah. Yeah. You know how I know? Because it says it right here. It's Mount Hermon. Right there. So the waters are waters of life. It started out at the beginning, but the waters also feel like you're drowning in them. So the irony is that the waters at the beginning are waters of life, but now the waters feel like they're all over you. They're all over you. So you're drowning in them. So waters can be waters of life, and they can also be waters of destruction. The irony of water. Anybody have any comments or thoughts? I'm going to play you in a moment a musical version of this that just came out a couple years ago. People love this psalm. They've loved this psalm for a long time. what was there an editorial decision to make this at the beginning of the next section because it was such a strong psalm? Maybe. But people still, this resonates with them. I'm going to play you one version of this song. Any comments or questions about the psalm though? Anybody have any thoughts about the psalm before I play a little version of this psalm that was done, ironically, another use of that term, in the sense that this psalm, this version we're going to do is Psalm 42 by Felix Mendelssohn. Does everyone know who Felix Mendelssohn was? Does anyone know who Felix Mendelssohn was?
German
Yes, composer.
classical romantic composer. He had a Jewish background.
Yeah. Does anyone know any Felix Mendelssohn pieces?
He wrote the
Who's Googling now?
wedding, one of the wedding tunes.
Yeah. Let me play you the Felix Mendelssohn that you know, because you all know Felix Mendelssohn. You just may not know you may not realize that you know Felix Mendelssohn, because as Rosemary just said, I will play you the part of Mendelssohn that you know. And here it is. But then I'm going to play you with Mendelssohn. This is the part of Mendelssohn that you know. So you all know that, right?
Right.
You've all heard that. They don't play that at weddings a lot, by the way, anymore.
They don't play it at Jewish weddings.
Very clear. But yes, that's one of his most famous pieces. But this is a piece that he did of Psalm 42. The heart, der Hirsch. You might have heard this before too, by the way. I don't know. I think it's beautiful. I mean, that's it's obviously being sung in German, so but it's a beautiful piece of music. So Felix Mendelssohn, as Rosemary shared, his grandfather Moses Mendelssohn was one of the greatest Jewish intellectuals of the last 500 years. He helped create what we call the Enlightenment period in Judaism. He argued that Jews need to be engaged in the world and also in Judaism. And he was he was considered the progenitor of what we call the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. Unfortunately, his son seems to have been a bit of a jerk and really, really didn't like being Jewish and didn't like, for whatever reasons, and maybe had some to do with family dynamics, didn't like his dad. And they were wealthy people. I mean, don't get me wrong, they were not poor, but there seems to have been some financial issues that happened too with the family. Well, what's interesting about Felix, his son, is Felix was baptized when he was 7, which means we really don't know how much of this was really a faith issue for the Mendelssohns. But interestingly, Felix did not seem to have that issue that his father had, and seemed to be somewhat more maybe proud of his Jewish identity than his father. He was Christian. I mean, don't get me wrong. He lived and died as a Christian, but his sister Fanny was brilliant. You can read about his sister Fanny as well, but his sister was an amazing composer in her own right. If she had lived in another day, she probably would have been more well known than her brother, but he was well known in his day. He became very sought after for compositions in his own day. So that they ended up having a great deal of success in their own lifetimes, but unfortunately Fanny died pretty young. But somebody ought to do a movie about the two of them, or at least a miniseries, because they were brilliant people in their own right, and didn't seem to have the same hangups that their father did, which is interesting, thinking about Korach and about, not having to repeat the mistakes of your parents. But I do want to play you another musical version of this, which is also, as I said, it's a very new version, but it's one that sounds old, but it's not. And so I'm going to share this piece with you now. Yeah, this was from 2 years ago. How did it get to be 2 years already? But yes, this was written for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. I'm going to play you a little piece of it. And this was written by a female composer. Let's listen to a little bit of Psalm 42 from the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. Shows you how, like the hind, like the hart, the deer to water. You probably saw this 2 years ago if you watched the funeral. Oh.
Not enough bandwidth, probably.
Frozen?
Is it frozen?
It's
Yeah.
frozen.
Oh, sorry. Looks like I'll share it again. Okay, now?
That's working.
Is it working now?
Yes.
So I want you to see, this is a psalm that the Jewish people wrote 2,000 years ago. maybe 2,500 years ago, probably actually not 2,000, but 2,500 years ago, that is still used and is still inspired people around the world in every language, and was still used as a spiritual message, if you will. This is the first, 7 lines that people are still singing and still feel connected to thousands of years later. So when we talk about, how do the Psalms, how does this play out in our lives? It's not just in our lives. I mean, this was played out in history in front of everybody, at one of the biggest events of the year. This psalm found its way into the liturgy for that service. And the people who decided that this was going to be sung, I mean, this was a choice that they made to have, to have this included in the Queen's funeral. It's part of history now. So again, whether it inspired people in the 1800s in Germany, or whether it inspired people in England 2 years ago, it still speaks to people. And yeah, so that's a little bit of the versions of this. We're going to see some of these phrases come up, and we're going to play some other versions of some of these other phrases that kind of go to this idea of our souls being thirsty for God. So that's Psalm 42, folks. It's not a very long psalm. It's not, it's not, is it, where does it fit into how I mean, is it because it's the first psalm of that new book, or was that chosen because it was such a psalm that even thousands of years ago people picked it up? Here's what I mean, I could probably ask Judith Weir if this had anything to do with it, with her decision to write a piece of music to the beginning of Psalm 42. Was it because it was the beginning psalm of a new book? I don't think so. I think the psalm was beautiful to people thousands of years ago, which is why it kicked off the book, and that's why people still are drawn to it. But I don't think people say, "Hey, it's the first psalm of the second book of Psalms, and that's why we have to do it." I think that, I mean, I could find out, but I don't think that's where it came from. I think it's because it's just a beautiful psalm. So, but again, some of the themes are going to go with that. Interestingly, and again, we don't know for sure, but people who study Psalms and who know it very well say, well, it didn't really end in chapter 42. I mean, the end of 42, this psalm, which doesn't have an inscription, is actually part of the same psalm. So whenever we don't have an inscription at the beginning of Psalms, people are starting to say, maybe it goes with the previous psalm. Maybe that's an artificial break, or a break that wasn't supposed to be there. We don't know for sure. We don't, but there are definitely people who will take that up, so that this was part of Psalm 42. It's 12 verses. It's possible, but we don't know that for sure. You can decide as we go through it. I'm just pointing out to you that some people say Psalm 42 and 43 are once part of the same psalm. Here we go.
Vindicate me, O God. Champion my cause against faithless people. Rescue me from the treacherous, dishonest man. For you are my God, my stronghold. Why have you rejected me? Why must I walk in gloom, oppressed by the enemy? Send forth your light and your truth. They will lead me. They will bring me to your holy mountain, to your dwelling place, that I may come to the altar of God. God, my delight, my joy, that I may praise you with a lyre, O God, my God. Why so downcast, my soul? Why disquieted within me? Have hope in God. I will yet praise him, my ever-present help, my God.
Yeah. So again, the next psalm begins with another Korach. That's another Korach psalm, right? and there's an inscription. This is also only 5 lines. And is it possible that it was part of the previous psalm? Yeah. Especially since it ends with the same. See? Right? It ends with the same type of words. I'm going back and forth between them so you could see them. Why so downcast my soul? Why have hope in God? I will yet praise him, my ever-present help, my God. Right? Got it? So could be a psalm that ended with 2 kind of refrains, right? Or there's not, the 2 refrains are the same, the same refrain. It ends with the refrain twice. So again, it's 5 verses, and it seems like very connected with the previous psalm, but we have it as 2 psalms. So Psalm 42 and Psalm 43, my gut is, yeah, it was part of the same psalm. Or maybe again, there was a version of the psalm that people sang without those 5 lines, and there was another version of this was the extended cut, right? It's possible, but it seems like they go together. So again, the theme of feeling rejected by God, but at the same point, knowing that that there's hope, and that I'm going to praise you. I'm going to here, the temple is a place where I will praise you. I'll come to your holy mountain. I'll come to the altar of God, and I will praise you with music. But again, this idea that the soul is, disturbed. And again, what's so interesting about it is, this kind of idea that we have. Where is it? Right here. Where again, in the refrain, he's addressing his soul like it's a separate entity, right?
Yeah,
So
I
my
was thinking
soul-
about that because I think of my soul as the part of me that's close to God, but here he's feeling like his soul is estranged and some other part of him is closer to God.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like his body or his
Mhm.
essence, this other essence to him, is saying, "Soul, don't worry about it. Have hope, soul." But it's almost again this idea that there's like some aspect of the ego or some aspect, of I only say it because we know the terminology, and we've heard the ego and id, and we've talked about how we've talked about on Wednesday nights too, when we talk about a soul in Judaism, that there's different phrases that are used, a nefesh or a neshama or a ruach, that there's like different levels of the soul. But this idea that, kind of like there's an essence to us that's the, if you will, if there's a part of us that is separate, that has an ego, it's almost as if the nefesh is the ego essence of who we are. And it's almost like the rest of the body, the rest of the essence, or maybe the essence that's really connected to God, what we would call the neshama, that the neshama is speaking to the nefesh, saying, nefesh, don't feel bad. God is with you. And, the idea that the neshama is literally God's essence in us is an interesting idea, because what would encourage the ego part of us to get over those humps? It's that, and I'm using the terms ego and nefesh interchangeably, and other people have done it. So this is not something new, but the idea that some aspect of our psychology or an aspect of our soul is almost talking to itself or talking to ourselves, isn't that, well, isn't that far-fetched from the standpoints of like psychology, the way some people would look at how we're made up psychologically. But but and I'm only thinking about it because my kids just saw Inside Out too, that
That's good.
people are really talking about it and thinking about it and really trying to understand these different dimensions of ourselves, that we have these internal dialogues within ourselves is an old idea. And that's if there's like if I can't, well, I don't know that I can even in the best situation explain what might be happening, because at the end of the day that's my interpretation anyways. But the interesting thing is that the idea that there's this internal monologue going on between these aspects of ourselves is an ancient idea. Whatever it means, however we can explain it, that there is that. But this idea that like some other part of ourselves cheers us up or gets us out of our sadness or our depression or our feeling of estrangement from God, that's an interesting thing, that there's a part of us that's saying that, right?
It's making me wonder what kind of cartoon you'd get if spirituality showed up at the console.
Yeah, I was just reading an article about it that someone sent me about the need for psychology to incorporate spirituality
Hmm.
into its practice is something that I think we'll eventually get back to at some point. But as as humanity tries to really understand itself,
Mhm.
but we're still in our infancy of understanding ourselves. But this idea that there are these
Definitely.
internal monologues that are going on, I think is really, to me, it's inspiring, and it's um it's uh it strengthens my conviction that the human experience, which we've talked about before, John's brought it up before, all of you have said it, is like, we haven't changed. I mean, humanity has not changed over thousands of years. And in a good way, I think that it shows us that people have had these discussions. And it's not only not, it's actually healthy, and it's affirming to me to know that we can have those discussions internally and know that there's like a biblical basis for it, a spiritual basis for it, an accepted and a completely accepted, at least in our tradition, a completely accepted understanding that that's okay. And not only okay, it's like normal. It's encouraged. It's healthy. So yeah, when we talk about cheering ourselves up, that's I'm a firm believer in that. And again, it's nice when other people help cheer us up too. But at the end of the day, we're the ones. It's our voice that we're going to hear. And yeah, at the end of the day, we finish this psalm, finish the previous psalm with this idea that have hope. God's there, and God's going to help. So even when we don't feel it. So that's Psalm 43, which again, maybe was also part of Psalm 42, but that's not what we have it. And so this next Psalm, Psalm 44, begins with another, again, Livnei Korach Maskil. So this definitely seems like, as 42 began, with a direction for the composer and for the conductor, or for who's going to play this. Here's Psalm 44.
We have heard, O God, our fathers have told us the deeds you performed in their time in days of old. With your hand you planted them, displacing nations. You brought misfortune on peoples and drove them out. It was not by their sword that they took the land. Their arm did not give them victory, but your right hand, your arm, and your good will, for you favored them. You are my king, O God. Decree victories for Jacob. Through you, we gore our foes. By your name, we trample our adversaries. I do not trust in my bow. It is not my sword that gives me victory. You give us victory over our foes. You thwart those who hate us. In God we glory at all times and praise your name unceasingly. Selah. Yet you have rejected and disgraced us. You do not go with our armies. You make us retreat before our foe. Our enemies plunder us at will. You let them devour us like sheep. You disperse us among the nations. You sell your people for no fortune. You set no high price on them. You make us the butt of our neighbors, the scorn and derision of those around us. You make us a byword among the nations, a laughingstock among the peoples. I am always aware of my disgrace. I am wholly covered with shame at the sound of taunting revilers in the presence of the vengeful foe. All this has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten you or been false to your covenant. Our hearts have not gone astray, nor have our feet swerved from your path. Though you cast us crushed to where the sea monster is and covered us over with deepest darkness, if we forgot the name of our God and spread forth our hands to a foreign God, God would surely search it out, for he knows the secrets of the heart. It is for your sake that we are slain all day long, that we are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awaken. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face, ignoring our affliction and distress? We lie prostrate in the dust. Our body clings to the ground. Arise and help us. Redeem us as befits your faithfulness.
And you can see why this psalm was not sung at the Queen's funeral. This is a completely different psalm than the previous psalm or two psalms that came before it, in the sense that, again, if that psalm was Psalm 42 was two psalms, this psalm goes in a completely different direction. Again, it's ascribed to the same authors, to the same people, but this psalm would be a psalm where people definitely feel God's rejection, and not as on a personal level, but on a national level. So the previous psalm really spoke kind of really just to the individual, as many of the psalms do. This is a psalm that really seems to be speaking to us as a people, teaching us our history. And again, if you look at some of the ways that people have looked at how this has been understood. You look at the Psalms, we have the historic situation that happens towards the beginning, the description of what's happening now, and the last part, which is hey, God, can you stop that bad stuff from happening? So, God, you helped us before. We're going through really bad times right now. What's interesting, of course, is that there doesn't seem to be an understanding that we've done anything to deserve it, where in other parts of the Bible, we do. And then it finishes, though, with, please let this stop. And so there are people who say, because of the references here, the reference to scattering the Israelites among the nations could point to a date after the Assyrians conquered the north in 722 or after the Babylonian exile in 586, right? But as it's been pointed out, the fact that there are armies here seems to indicate that this is before the exile, the Babylonian exile happened, because Israel still has armies now. And when after the Babylonian exile, they really didn't have an army of their own. That's one of the things that kind of leads us to believe that it's old, but it's not from after the destruction of the temple, that it's like before the temple is about to be destroyed. which again still places around 2,500. Here again, you can see some of the places that it's used. It's quoted or some, again, referenced in the Christian Bible, but not a psalm that is referred to in our prayers a lot, and not referred to in Christianity a lot. But again, it's a longer psalm. You can see that there may be differences of opinion on how it's organized, but there definitely seems to be a structure where the psalmist at the beginning says, God, you have helped us in the past, and how this situation is really bad right now, but come back and help us like you did before. Now, again, as I said, there seems to be a lack of responsibility that the people have, in the sense that they've done anything wrong, right? Which we know from the way the prophets talk about it, because we've read the prophets. They had been false with God. They had been false in the covenant. They had forgotten God. They had been led astray, right? The phrase here that, again, some people are looking at is, why does it say tanin? This is not the only time, by the way, that Ezekiel is not the only time that we hear the word tanim or tanin. It is like the Leviathan, or maybe synonymous with the Leviathan. It is a sea monster. It's a sea creature that is at the bottom of the depths, and it's the sea creature that scares us because it's destructive. It's Godzilla lying at the bottom of the water, ready to come out and destroy us, and creates storms and tempests in the waters when it gets mad. So the sea monster is there at the bottom. But again, I just want to point out that at the very beginning of the psalm, when it talks about us when we experience God's help and God's coming to our aid, and goring our adversaries, which again is one of the reasons why you're not going to see this in a psalm, for the church's funeral, or the Queen's funeral in a church. Look, there's parts of this that you and I would say, well, that doesn't seem very politically correct. Well, not just you're goring your enemies, but I'm talking about this.
Displacing nations, yeah.
It says flat out, we displaced the Canaanites. We know it. The Canaanites, we're told, were uprooted by God as punishment. The Bible tells us that. It tells us that literally in Deuteronomy, right before we're going in. Remember, we're reading this section now coming up. God told us, it's not because you're so good. I mean, I promised your ancestors I was going to give you this land, but the reason that it's taken so long to some extent is I had to wait for the Canaanites to no longer be worthy to be there. They had to be so bad that I could kick them out. So there's no question that the Canaanites got uprooted. It's right here. Yeah. So there was a golden age. There was a time when God did this kind of stuff for us. Not doing it now, but maybe God will do it later. Now, I mean, for us now. I mean, doesn't happen tomorrow, and maybe the next day. God's going to help us. God's going to vindicate us and come to our aid like God used to do. So, again, not politically correct, not what people want to hear, but it's what the Bible tells us. It's consistent with the Bible. And again, I'd say the only thing that's not really consistent with the Bible in this psalm is this idea that the prophets make it pretty clear that we deserved what happened to us. This does not indicate that we deserve it. So, it's an interesting idea that, trying to figure out when this was written, maybe sometime between 722 and 586, which again would place it about 2,600 years ago. again, it's a psalm that doesn't really hit us on a personal level like the previous psalm did, but definitely on a national level. So there are psalms that we have that are really national psalms. This would be one of them. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Well, then let's listen to another Korach psalm. But this one has a little extra stuff. Actually, two extra stuff here. Little weird directions, right? Lamnat is for the leader, for the composer, the conductor, the conductor, not really composer, the conductor. And then it says on Shoshanim. Well, we don't know for sure what Shoshanim are. We do know that they're flowers, right? They're flowers. They're lilies, right? Shoshana. Gail, right? Did we lose you?
Oh, I'm here. Yes, my daughter, Shoshana. Exactly.
So Shoshanim are a beautiful flower. It's used in the book, the Song of Songs, right? We sing Erev Shel Shoshanim, one of the most famous songs that is adapted from the Song of Songs, which we oftentimes play at Jewish weddings, or we used to a lot more, Erev Shel Shoshanim. But here it seems to have something to do with the way it was played. It says on Shoshanim, was that what they called certain types of instruments? Maybe not the strings, or maybe the shape of them, or maybe the song kinds of songs that came out of them that we call them Shoshanim. We don't know. But what's interesting is it does have this idea of it being a love song, a song of Yedidit or Yedidut, or Yedid, like say Yedid Nefesh, which isn't always necessarily romantic song, but it's love of some type of desire. What does the King James call Shir Yedidut? Yedidut, sorry. Does it call it a love song?
A song of loves.
Yeah. So it's a plural, which is why it's a loves in there, but it is some type of love, or again, desired. Yedid. It's the word that we sometimes translate as dear. So when we say in Hebrew, dear so-and-so, we say Yedid or Yedidah, my dearest. Doesn't necessarily always have to be romantic, but definitely seems maybe there's some elements in the description at the beginning. Well, let's decide as we read the psalm whether this is a love song. Would you consider this a love song?
My heart is astir with gracious words. I speak my poem to a king. My tongue is the pen of an expert scribe. You are fairer than all men. Your speech is endowed with grace. Rightly has God given you an eternal blessing. Gird your sword upon your thigh, O hero, in your splendor and glory. In your glory, win success. Ride on in the cause of truth and meekness and right, and let your right hand lead you to awesome deeds. Your arrows, sharpened, pierce the breast of the king's enemies. Peoples fall at your feet. Your divine throne is everlasting. Your royal scepter is a scepter of equity. You love righteousness and hate wickedness.
Oh, sorry. Ugh, blew that. Did not mean to hit that part. Whoa.
Rightly has God, your God, chosen to anoint you with oil of gladness over all your peers. All your robes are fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. From ivoried palaces, lutes entertain you. Royal princesses are your favorites. The consort stands at your right hand, decked in gold of Ophir. Take heed, lass, and note. Incline your ear, forget your people and your father's house, and let the king be aroused by your beauty. Since he is your Lord, bow to him. O Tyrian lass, the wealthiest people will court your favor with gifts, goods of all sorts. The royal princess, her dress embroidered with golden mountings, is led inside to the king. Maidens in her train, her companions, are presented to you. They are led in with joy and gladness. They enter the palace of the king. Your sons will succeed your ancestors. You will appoint them princes throughout the land. I commemorate your fame for all generations, so peoples will praise you forever and ever.
So what do we make of this psalm?
Not politically correct.
What?
I said it's not politically correct.
No. So was this a love song? Was this I mean, what do we
Sounds
make
like
of
the
this
king
song?
got a present of a foreign bride and a bunch of handmaidens, and
Yes.
somebody wrote a song in honor of that.
Yeah, the psalm is in itself somewhat of a it's somewhat of a puzzle, because when we think about like, why would anyone want to sing this psalm, right? Why would anyone like, who does this connect with, right? Where who wants this psalm? Like, who wants to hear this psalm? Look, I would definitely say this is not a psalm that people say, yeah, this is a psalm that I say when I'm in trouble. This is a psalm that I say when I'm feeling depressed or alone, sad. This seems to be pretty specific for a certain time, place, and most importantly, a person. In Jewish tradition, the references to this, or how this is set up. And again, I'm just going to tell you, like, when you hear this, you're going to say, what? And I'm only telling you this because everything that we've been told for the last 2,000 years goes out the window. Because does anyone want to guess Jewish tradition says this is supposed to be about? Anybody want to guess?
Esther?
No, no, that's good, but it's kind of a key to, like, the last verses of this.
Solomon?
No, but you're close. You're getting closer. The Messiah, the end king, if you will, because it seems as though the psalm is talking about the fact that a queen is going to be made and she's going to have sons, right? Look, the fact that nobody saw it is because it's not really there. But it has to be there to some extent, because people would say, what's this psalm about? Like, this is a psalm that, like, is for the king when he's taking a new bride. That's exactly what Rosemary said. It seems to be literally for a guy in a certain place, one guy, and he's getting excited because he's going to have a queen and he's going to have kids with that queen, etc. But for us, that's exactly what the Messiah was. The Messiah was a descendant of King David, who everybody is going to love. Everyone's going to want to have the Messiah. So this is kind of like the Messiah's inception story, if you will. And so when we get to the end, I commemorate your fame for all generations, so people will praise you forever and ever. That's because the Messiah is coming through you. So again, it goes against our concept of a Messiah, because so much of our concept of a Messiah is based on Jesus. And I'm talking about Jews. I'm talking about, because Jews have, like, whenever we talk about Messiah, virtually it's in the and I'm talking about, this is only the last 200 years. 200 years ago, when we were living in shtetls, our concept of Messiah was we were able to say Psalm 45 is talking about the Messiah, the descendant of King David. As we've lived amongst Christians and we know we're exposed a lot more to Christianity, and we have Christian family members and Christian neighbors and everything else that we know, and every church that we've gone into, our ancestors never went into a church. They didn't go. If they went into a church, it's because they became a Christian and then they were gone. They didn't know. And so they didn't think about the messianic implications of what Jesus was for a Messiah, which is really breaking away from the royal Messiah. Again, there are pictures of Jesus as a royal Messiah. Don't get me wrong. There is Middle Ages, you'll see in some of the art and some of the references, you'll see that Christ is king stuff. But it's not usually the part that most of us interact with when we talk to Christians today. It's not a big part of Christian theology today. That being said, there were times that it was. But for us, it always was, because for us, the Messiah was always a descendant of King David and essentially was royal. So that's why we could say that. That's why when I tell you that this was, in our conception, a messianic psalm, it's not messianic like Messianic Judaism or Jews for Jesus or Christian stuff. It is Messiah, son of David, the king. So that's how we perceived it, or allowed it to continue to be a psalm that resonated for us, because it was about that. All right. So that's all I'm saying, is I'm not saying it necessarily makes any more sense to you. But it definitely feels like a love song. It seems like a love song from a king to a queen that he's about to make his queen, which is also what Song of Songs is about. Just again, parts of it or lines of it make a lot of sense from the standpoint of love songs, of a love song, when we take it out, when we take out the parts that we like. But these same phrases of myrrh and aloes and cassia, the different spices and the palaces, right? And the gold, that phrase, the gold of Ophir, is exactly the language that we also have in Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, which is very short, by the way. Song of Songs is not a long book and is not anywhere near as complex and as varied as the Psalms are, but this is very similar to what we have in Song of Songs, which we'll get to. We'll get there. Any questions, comments, any thoughts about this? I mean, it is interesting that she's called a Bat Tzur. Was this queen literally from Tyre, from Lebanon? Maybe. It was the capital of Phoenicia, of the Phoenician Empire. And Solomon, at least, was married to Tyrian women. So, yeah, it's very possible. Any questions, comments, thoughts about Psalm 45? Again, that's about 18 verses. I'd say it's kind of about average. The next psalm begins with Lamnat Seach, B'nai Korach. But here we have another one that we've seen before, an Alamot, right? Which is, again, is it an instrument? Is it a style? Is it a way that it was played? It was a way that it was sung, a cappella with a certain, flair. We don't know. But this psalm, again, is one of those psalms, as we have for the last few psalms. This is another B'nai Korach psalm. This is a psalm where, again, the ascription is, and definitely in the organizational structure, were these psalms put together because they were all B'nai Korach psalms? Yeah. Editorially, maybe they were from a composition or a collection that was originally just the B'nai Korach psalms, which were then incorporated, which were then added to the rest of the psalms. Again, what's interesting is that psalm is a very royal psalm. So if David, or one of David's family members, had written that psalm, it would make total sense. it would be very consistent with a psalm that a king, would write, not necessarily, again, a psalm that has anything to do with, well, with anybody else for that matter. So, that is like I said, to some extent, it's an interesting, an interesting, almost ultra specific psalm. So let's take a look at now. No more questions.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
can I ask a favor? Can you decrease it just a little so I can see the verse numbers?
yeah. So I gotta bring it over, actually. I gotta decrease it
There you go.
a little so you can see the
Thank you.
psalm number. So this is Psalm 46, again, on an alamot, maybe again, the instrument that it was played on.
God is our refuge and stronghold, a help in trouble, very near. Therefore we are not afraid, though the earth reels, though mountains topple into the sea, its waters rage and foam, in its swell mountains quake. Selah. There is a river whose streams gladden God's city, the holy dwelling place of the Most High. God is in its midst, it will not be toppled. By daybreak, God will come to
Yes.
its nations rage, kingdoms topple.
Yes.
The sound of his thunder,
Yes.
the earth dissolves. The Lord of hosts is with us.
Oh, I don't need, thank you.
Oh, hold a second. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Nations rage, kingdoms topple. At the sound of his thunder, the earth dissolves. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our haven. Selah. Come and see what the Lord has done, how he has wrought desolation on the earth. He puts a stop to wars throughout the earth, breaking the bow, snapping the spear, consigning wagons to the flames. Desist, realize that I am God. I dominate the nations. I dominate the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our haven. Selah.
So this psalm kind of goes in a completely different direction than the previous psalm, and maybe kind of goes back to the psalm before it, Psalm 44, in that this is kind of a national psalm. This is definitely a psalm of God coming to our aid. Again, it's not about one specific person who's our enemy, but nations that would come against us. And it definitely feels like somebody is speaking to the group, encouraging them as a group, and to have hope, right? That God is going to come to our aid. Now, again, this idea that God is going to put a stop to war throughout the world is something that, again, people have been hoping for. It seems like we're further away from that than we were maybe a couple of years ago, but that's the hope. But there's this interesting kind of like putting words into, God, this is God speaking, right? Desist, realize that I am God. I dominate the nations. I dominate the earth. So, we're putting into God's mouth, there's no person that does that. It's God, right? It's only God. And this is an idea that, we put our trust in God. And it doesn't feel, at least in this psalm, that God is not on our side, right? There isn't this feeling of, but God's left us, God come back. This is, there never seems to be any feeling like God isn't with us, or that we're in any danger whatsoever. There's danger, right? There is danger, but we're not in any danger. It's a very hopeful and very affirming psalm without the feeling like there's anything for us to be afraid. It doesn't say what river this is, right? So, there's speculation of what are they talking about? What river gladdens God's city, right? Because the Jordan River doesn't really flow into Jerusalem, right? But there seems to be this like river that does. But we do know, and we read it in Ezekiel, that there will be at one point, a river that feeds Jerusalem, but also river that comes from Jerusalem that will, to some extent, turn everything back to life. Whether that's supposed to be literal or metaphorically, that river is going to even bring life back to the area of the Dead Sea. That area is going to be brought back to life by the water that comes out of Jerusalem. So it seems like they're talking about Jerusalem because it says God's city, and we have no reason to believe that this is not Jerusalem. But yeah, we don't know which river they're talking about here. Is this a river that's eventually going to be coming out of Jerusalem? Yeah.
Rabbi, you want me to read my note?
Yes, please.
Jerusalem has had no river, unlike Thebes, Damascus, Nineveh, or Babylon. Yet she had a river here. Here, the river of serves as a metaphor for the continual outpouring of the sustaining and refreshing blessings of God, which make the city of God like the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Or the New Jerusalem.
Yes. So that's kind of based on what I was talking about. That
Yeah.
Ezekiel talks about the New Jerusalem, that there's a river that comes out of it. And again, is it a metaphor? Is it talking about the energy and the blessing that comes out of Jerusalem? But there does seem to be this idea that, it's a river that's going to gladden people. It's going to make people. But yeah, it's like, what river are they talking about here? Because there isn't a river. And that's, by the way, it's an important, physical and historical part of Jerusalem, is that there's no natural water there. We've talked about the spring that Hezekiah brought the water into Jerusalem with. That was critical. Just to have that spring was critical. But to think about it from the standpoint of a capital city, or a city again that people are flocking to, even to this day, a city that doesn't have a water source.
What feeds that river?
What?
What feeds that tunnel that is Ezekiel?
Oh,
Where's the water come
it's a
from?
spring. It's a spring. It's a
Where-
natural spring. The
Oh, it's a
Gihon
natural spring outside of Jerusalem?
Yeah, it's just outside the walls, which is why they had to bring it in through an aqueduct, an underground aqueduct. And again, we think that aqueduct existed, but what Hezekiah did was expand it, make it bigger, and actually bring the water right into Jerusalem and create a pool, a reservoir where that water could be accessed. The major thing. But again, to have a city that doesn't have a river, that doesn't have a natural source of water, is really, really hard. Even if it has, as we talked about, it's on hills, it's on a city of, it's on a, the natural topography of the city allows for it to be protected. But the problem is that it doesn't have a water source, which is why that when Hezekiah was under siege by the Assyrians, that water was so critical to be able to get it in there where the Assyrians couldn't stop it up. So it's critical to be able to have water, but it's very rare for a city or a major city or a capital not to have a river. And by the way, that goes to America today. I mean, the fact that Los Angeles doesn't have a river, doesn't have a natural source of water. Look, I mean, you can watch Chinatown and recall that getting water to Los Angeles was a major feat in the 1920s. And it requires a whole lot of work to get that water to us, but in LA. But a city in the ancient world that didn't have water was almost unheard of, which is why it talks about in Glory's commentary, all the cities, in ancient Egypt and Babylonia and all these great cities that all had a river. But again, you go to almost any city in America outside of our city, and it's always on a river. It's not just for transportation, but of course for fresh water. But you think of all these cities, that are bisected or that are built around the city, or the city was built around the river. I mean, that's the norm. I mean, that was the norm throughout human history until literally, again, the irony of Southern California is a city that was built was built without fresh water. I mean, it's like, even as I say it, it's insane that, you know, we have this megalopolis that has no fresh water. I mean, look, I hope one day we have desalinization, and we set up a way to get water into our city that doesn't require us to be reliant on the Colorado River or the water that, you know, we bring in now from, you know, thankfully. By the way, I just drove past Pyramid Lake over the weekend, and my goodness, in my entire life, I've never seen so much water in Pyramid Lake. I love seeing it. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to see the water, but yeah, it's not normal. It's not, I mean, in that way, LA and Jerusalem are actually very connected, in the fact that there's no reason for those cities to exist other than somebody dreamt them up. And King David dreamt up Jerusalem. We seem to have this idea that King David, or at least through God, you know, made Jerusalem the capital, and some very ambitious people decided to make Los Angeles a city and bring the water down to us in a very complicated and expensive way. Thank God they did. Otherwise, we wouldn't be there. But anyways, and it's not just LA. I mean, it's pretty much all of Southern California. So yeah, they didn't, what river are they talking about? What river are we talking about? So we're going to read one more Psalm today. We're going to read Psalm 47, which again is another Korachite Psalm. There's no other description. There's no other detail. Nothing else we know. It just says a mizmor, a Psalm. And again, another Korach one. So let's take a look at this one. It's a wonderful way for us to end and then hopefully go into a good day.
All you peoples, clap your hands. Raise a joyous shout for God. For the Lord Most High is awesome, great King over all the earth. He subjects peoples to us, sets nations at our feet. He chose our heritage for us, the pride of Jacob, whom he loved. Selah. God ascends midst acclamation, the Lord to the blasts of the horn. Sing, oh, sing to God. Sing, oh, sing to our King, for God is King over all the earth. Sing a hymn. God reigns over the nations. God is seated on his holy throne. The great of the peoples are gathered together, the retinue of Abraham's God, for the guardians of the earth belong to God. He is greatly exalted.
Yeah, and it's a great psalm. I mean, that's a great, you know, psalm of hope, of success. Clap your hands, right? There seems to be within this psalm this idea of celebrating and singing within the psalm. You know, we believe this is a very old psalm, right? This is a psalm that, you know, goes back to, you know, the beginnings of Jewish songs. You know, this is a psalm that you know, seems to be celebrating God, right? And God's enthronement, God's being in power. We have a traditions, you know, one of the things that was sometimes done was this psalm was sung during the shofar blowing on Rosh Hashanah. So why? Because, you know, it seems to be a psalm of celebrating and you know, the fact that the psalm itself says, right, in case you didn't catch it, God is going up with the truah, right? God is going up. God is going up with the kol shofar. So the psalm itself kind of tells us that there's the sounds of the shofar and people are singing and celebrating. Again, you know, for Christians, this became a psalm of Jesus. But, you know, this is really recognizing God. And what's interesting, of course, is that we don't have I don't know that we've had a psalm yet that actually mentions Abraham. We've had several psalms that talk about Jacob, but Abraham is mentioned here. It's Abraham who is the psalm of is the unifier here. Abraham is the we're the descendants of Abraham, which we usually, that includes other people, and not just Israelites, not just Bnei Israel. It would include the Edomites, it would include Moabites to some extent, because they're Abraham's nephew's kids, but they're kind of like more of our people, the Arameans who are related to Abraham. So this is a unifying psalm, I would say, less of God being necessarily just for the Jewish people, just in Israel. But when it says the great of the peoples are gathered together, that seems to imply other kings and other peoples. It seems to be a celebration of everybody celebrating God, which of course is, kind of the hope that we had. I mean, yeah, Jacob's actually mentioned right there, right? The Gaon Yaakov, the pride of Jacob. So this psalm has definitely a celebration of God. It's a celebration of the fact that God, is going to be praised not just by us, but by people all around the earth, all over the place. They're gonna sing, and they're gonna recognize God. So this is again. Next week when we come back, we're going to read some more psalms that are Korachite psalms that are from this section of psalms that are Bnei Korach. But so we're not done. We're not done with Bnei Korach. But you can see that there is within the Bnei Korach psalms some different kinds of themes and some different ideas that are. Some of them are universal, some of them are particular to us. Some of them talk about Israel, just Israel. Some of them, I mean, technically speaking, this psalm does say on his holy throne. I mean, is that Jerusalem or is it God's throne up in heaven? I mean, I don't know. But yeah, there's definitely some psalms that are very personal, that are very individual. But again, there is this section that we're reading right now of Bnei Korach, which I think you can see has a slightly different tone than some of the psalms we read, especially in the 20s. So I think as you're reading them together and you're reading them in their entirety, not just snippets or just 7 verses of something, you can start to see it. And that's why we're studying it like this. So you can see Psalms in their entirety and you can start making connections across the Psalms and to some extent, again, see how they're different. Because I think you're seeing, and John raised this question, aren't these Psalms all kind of the same? They're not. And as you see them, as you accumulate Psalms in your knowledge, and again, I don't remember every Psalm, and I don't, if somebody says, hey, what's Psalm 47? Sometimes I'll remember, yeah, it says the shofar is black, we hear the sound of the shofar, but I mean, I don't remember all the Psalms and by number and they definitely are different. I mean, the Psalms, the Psalms that, that speak to us, there might be 4 or 5 Psalms that we, pick out or the Psalms that we know well. And some of them are not picked out by us. They were picked out by other people that we're not going to forget. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I mean, there's nothing I can do or you can do or anybody can do to get that out of your head. It's in your head. But there's other Psalms that hopefully you'll be exposed to that, I don't want to speak on behalf of Reverend Lynn, but Reverend Lynn said it a few weeks ago. She doesn't love Psalm 23. And, look, maybe it's because everybody knows it and you feel like you have to know it. But look, maybe, again, everyone hopefully will pick out some Psalms that are meaningful for them and, either find some music, accompany it that you like. Maybe you write your own music, or maybe again, it's not the music behind it that's special. But yeah, thank you everybody for being here today. Hopefully you'll go out and and here's some good psalms and some good music this week. We don't have class tomorrow night. On Wednesday night, we will be probably not. Well, we're not going to have class unless something happens and this event gets canceled next Wednesday. We won't be having Wednesday night the next two Wednesdays, tomorrow or the following Wednesday. But we will be in person next Tuesday and online, God willing. And again, hopefully you'll hear some good music in your life. And you know what? I encourage everybody, if you want, to go out and listen to some Mendelssohn's, Fanny or her more famous brother Felix. But they were really, I think they're amazing music. I mean, two of them. I mean, Felix obviously is more well known, but I think you'll find that their music is quite powerful and really stands up. And really stands up. So, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you, Rosemary, for reading.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. We'll see you.
Thanks,
Thank
Rabbi.
you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.